Let's take a few minutes and discuss the keynote reading for this chapter. It deals with the intergovernmental problem of marijuana. It deals with the limits of personal freedom placed on citizens by government. For many generations, the topic of marijuana has been a mainstay of discussion on America's college campuses. As students examine their personal freedoms and the limits that may be placed on them by the law, conversations regularly turn to the rules that govern their access to one of the most controversial substances in the United States. In the U.S., unlike many countries, unless something is specifically outlawed or otherwise regulated by a government, people are free to engage in activities as they please. Rather than government controlling people's lives and allowing certain activities, the U.S. Constitution and its amendments place limitations on the power of government to control individual behavior. Marijuana and its place in contemporary society provides a familiar case study in the complexities and tensions of intergovernmental relations in the United States. Marijuana has a long history of use in America. The hemp plant, used in making rope and canvas for sailing ships, from which marijuana is also derived, was a common part of colonial-era agriculture. The use of marijuana as an intoxicant became prevalent in late 19th and early 20th centuries America. Excessive use of marijuana by some during the early 20th century did result in incidents where individuals engaged in behaviors that were harmful to themselves or to others. However, any real dangers or problems associated with its use paled in comparison with the portrayal of marijuana as dangers within the American media. Films such as the 1936 propaganda movie Reefer Madness comically dramatized how marijuana leads to sexual promiscuity, the murder of one's parents, and the liking for jazz music. The poster from the movie is pictured to the right of the slide. This was complicated by highly negative stories by the newspapers of William Randolph Hearst, which printed sensational and highly questionable stories designed to fuel public fear about marijuana's threat to American society. As the 20th century began, public fears served to encourage government action on the nation's marijuana problem. The placard at the left of the screen was typical of the types of banners and other public service announcements that would be placed in various public locations by all levels of government to warn the public about the dangers of marijuana. As regulation of marijuana was emerging out of Washington, D.C., the states took the lead in banning marijuana completely. As early as 1907, California, and continuing with dozens of other states through the 1930s, began to make marijuana an illegal substance, with possession and production of the intoxicant ruled as criminal offenses, punishable by fines and jail time. This patchwork of marijuana laws throughout the nation in the first quarter of the 20th century, and the growing public concern with all forms of intoxicants during the age of Prohibition, helped lead Congress to work on establishing more consistent rules on the sale and trafficking of cannabis. Congress created the Uniform Narcotics Act as model legislation for states to follow. At first, a few states signed on to voluntary standards immediately, but the efforts of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration and an impressive propaganda effort on the radio resulted in every state signing on to the standards by 1935. Even with the adoption of uniform regulations by all the states, there was continued pressure in Washington for the federal government to be more aggressive in fighting cannabis use. At the forefront of this campaign for a stronger federal presence was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry Anslinger. As the first director of the FBN, Anslinger became a crusader for tougher federal narcotics laws. As is often the case with federal efforts to change behaviors, the power of taxation was selected as the tool by which the feds could attack marijuana use in America. This resulted in congressional passage of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. This act placed taxes on anyone dealing commercially in cannabis and established heavy fines and jail sentences for individuals not in compliance with the act. It did not specifically criminalize the possession or use of cannabis, but the impact of the law was nonetheless enormous in terms of limiting access to marijuana. States responded by cracking down on their own marijuana laws over the following 3 decades. Anslinger and his allies in the nation's capital had successfully created an environment where any state going against the federal position on cannabis was seen as putting the interests of decadent, drug-induced minorities against the protection of decent, law-abiding white Americans. The 1960s was a time of great change in America, both socially and politically. In the American culture of the era, it became more fashionable to question the legitimacy of federal action. This included eras such as the Vietnam War, as well as many people questioning government roles into the incursions of individual freedoms. This Life magazine cover from 1969 depicts questions about marijuana use at the time. It was also becoming apparent that the costs of implementing prohibitions of marijuana were rising. The federal government, under Richard Nixon, even reconsidered its hardline stance on cannabis through a well-publicized commission on drug policy. In 1973, Oregon became the first state to decriminalize marijuana. Soon other states followed, and by 1978, 8 states had followed Oregon's lead. These states' actions directly contradicted federal policies that identified marijuana as an illegal narcotic. The federal government did not recognize the decriminalization efforts and held that federal public administrators, such as those in the Drug Enforcement Agency, would follow federal standards even if state laws differed. This meant that even if the locals wouldn't arrest you for smoking pot, the feds still might. By the 1990s, the American public's view on marijuana had changed dramatically. This resulted in states such as California legalizing the use of marijuana as long as for medical purposes. Unlike decriminalization, legalization means that the state permits the use of cannabis as long as a prescription for the substance has been obtained from a medical doctor. A number of states quickly followed California's lead, with more than a dozen states providing legal protections for marijuana for medical purposes by 2011. While legalized medical marijuana became popular in the states, the federal government refused to yield on its stance that marijuana had no medical properties and that therefore state laws legalizing the use of cannabis for medical purposes would not be recognized at the federal level. As with most policies that are conflicting, it ended up in the courts. By 2005, it had reached the U.S. Supreme Court. That court held that Congress may ban the use of marijuana even in cases where states have legalized its use for medical purposes. The court's decision in this case rested on the position that the federal government has powers under the Constitution to regulate commerce, and that those powers trumped California's policy on medical marijuana. What is perhaps most interesting about the aftermath of the Gonzalez case was that the decision did not seem to slow the growth of medical marijuana use in California and other states. Federal involvement in the enforcement of marijuana laws changed dramatically with the election of President Barack Obama in 2008. His administration has taken a very different position on marijuana. Soon after taking office, U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder ordered that the DEA will no longer raid medical marijuana retail outlets. In effect, the federal government called a truce on states on this matter. The laws had not changed, and the Fed continued to have the authority to crack down on medical marijuana laws and medical marijuana use. The desire to do so had simply dissipated with the arrival of the Obama administration. With states facing unprecedented fiscal crisis, the pressure to legalize and tax marijuana will continue to grow. If states turn to pot as a cure for their financial woes, the feds may have to reconsider its position as well. This has not lessened the debate among those in favor of loosening the marijuana laws and those who believe existing federal policy should be enforced. President Obama himself has admitted to substantial drug use in the past. He is one of the lucky ones who avoided incarceration. Despite the liberalization of efforts to enforce federal laws governing marijuana under President Barack Obama, the fact remains that thousands of young people are having their lives ruined by what he knows to be ill-advised policies that he could change for the better in major ways with the stroke of a pen. If you notice the slide on this page and the preceding page, it indicates how laws have changed just between 2008 and 2014 at the state level. One of your assignments for this week is to answer the discussion questions at the end of the keynote. After you read the keynote section and the rest of the reading for this week, answer these questions and post them online. Good luck.